Welcome back, everybody, to the Ketodontist Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Matt. So happy you're here with me again. This is episode 6, which is the second part of our interview with Amy Berger. I hope you listened to part 1. If not, go back, listen to it. It kind of lays the foundation of this episode. We're really going to be going into more of a deep dive on this episode. So if you didn't follow part 1, you might be kind of lost a little bit. A couple of apologies. First apology is I'm so sorry that I did not have this released on Monday. I've been doing some pretty long interviews, and my hosting site, Libsyn, I had already used up my data for the month, and I even have one of the higher end plans. And so, but because we've been going more than hour long for a lot of our interviews or episodes, we ran out of space, so I had to wait for the rollover to the next month. So I apologize for that. Second, I apologize for in this episode for going out in the weeds a little bit. I was geeking out something fierce, and we kind of do a deep dive. We kind of get down the weeds. We kind of wax philosophical about evolution and ancestral health and all that stuff. So I apologize for that. We rein it back in, but just to give you fair warning on that, just me thinking out loud type of thing. And so before we get started, a little bit of a check-in. Things have been going awesome here. This weekend I will be traveling to Austin. If anybody wants to meet up, if I can get away from my dental meeting, if I have a little extra time to say hi to anybody, let me know. Last weekend, we traveled to Springfield, Illinois for the baptism of my godson, Graham. And travel has always been tricky for me. I've always gained weight while traveling. But this time, when I weighed in on Monday, I weighed 299.6. First time I've ever lost weight while traveling, and I am officially under 300 pounds. So the next goal will be 290. The goal after that will be 280, and we're just going to continue to chip and chip and chip away at this. But I'm officially under 300 pounds. So went from 353 or something like that to now under 300 pounds. So there you go. All right. Well, without further ado, let us roll into part 2 of our interview with Amy Berger of To It Nutrition and the Alzheimer's Antidote. Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of our interview with Amy Berger. I hope you listened to part 1. We really dived into what Alzheimer's really is, what seems to be the root cause behind it, even though it is multifactorial. We talked and unpacked a little bit about where we're kind of missing the boat in medicine with what's really behind the cause of this degenerative decline. So I really hope that you go back. If you haven't listened to episode 1, do so, because we really set the stage for this second half that we're going to be really diving into low carbohydrate, the role of insulin, and all that stuff. So, all right. So, Amy, picking up for where we left off there, and our last question, we were talking about Alzheimer's being nicknamed type 3 diabetes and why that may or may not be applicable. Getting into the role of carbohydrates, the role of metabolism, I absolutely loved your book in the way that you break down. One thing that really opened my eyes was how you break down how much storage we can handle of different macronutrients like glucose or carbs versus protein versus fat, and how from an evolutionary standpoint, it seems pretty clear that fat was meant to be a pretty big part in our diet. Can you go into a little bit about that with me?
Sure. So the human body, we can run on a lot of different fuels, right? We can use carbohydrate, we can use fat, we can
Yep.
use alcohol, we can use amino acids, which come from protein. And you'll often hear people say that glucose is the preferred fuel for the body, or glucose is you know, the preferred fuel for the brain.
Right.
And I don't know if it's preferred or it's just used first. Like as long as there's a lot of glucose to be had, the body will use glucose.
Yeah.
If there's not as much glucose or not as much carbohydrate, the body has to use something else.
Uh-huh.
It's got to get fuel. And the second thing it will turn to in most cases is fat.
Yeah.
And it will only turn to fat though when insulin levels are low.
Right.
Insulin actually directly inhibits the body's ability to use fat for fuel, which is why, low carb diets tend to be so good for fat loss. Like when you get that insulin low, your body is finally able to tap into your stored body fat to
Right.
use for fuel. There are some researchers that are coming out with a pretty interesting theory that, or maybe it's a hypothesis at this point, I don't know, where we use fuel in proportion to our body's ability to store it.
Mm-hmm.
So we we can store a little bit of glucose in our liver, a little bit in our muscles, but we can't store all that much of it. We can store a ton of fat. And
Right.
anyone who's struggling with fat loss knows that we can store an almost unlimited amount of fat.
Right.
And so, because we can't store a lot of glucose, we have to use it. So, if you eat a bagel, you're going to burn carbohydrate. If you don't eat a whole lot of carbohydrate, you will have to tap into the fat. And I don't think that fat is this sort of backup emergency fuel. I think fat is the fuel we were probably supposed to be running on most of the time.
Yeah, and you had cited, I think it was I can't remember if it's a physiology textbook or a biochemistry textbook, but I still have my physiology and biochemistry textbooks from college because I'm kind of a book hoarder, and so I need to go get those out of the out of storage and see if I have similar figures in my text. But you had and this is paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact figures in your book, but you basically broke down how much glucose, and this I think was an average in the text was an average of in an average 155-pound individual, and it didn't say if it was man or woman, but anyways, um, in a 155-pound individual, it was like 20 calories worth of glucose in the blood, X amount in the liver, X amount in muscle glycogen, and really in our body stores at one time for that average individual is only like about 800 calories worth of glycogen stores. Um, does that sound about right? Or am I just totally butchering that?
No, that sounds about right, but I'm going to see if I can find it. I have it on a blog post and I'm in front of my computer. I might be
Okay,
able to find
great.
it, but yeah, there's only a couple of hundred calories worth of stored glucose in the body.
Mm-hmm.
So if the quote unquote gas tank of our body can't even store all that much glucose, why would we think that glucose is the fuel that our body likes the best? Wouldn't we
Right.
be able to store a lot more of it if
Yeah.
if that was the best fuel for us?
Yeah. I was just thinking of something, and maybe this would be I don't know if this would be a great description or not, but I was just thinking about it of glycogen versus fat stores and using for fuel. If you had like your if you had like a if you had a car that could run on both like gas or diesel, and you had your main tank was gas, in this case will be your large tank would be gas, which would be fat, and you had a small reserve tank of diesel, but it was only just a couple gallons worth, and your main gas tank was 20 gallons. And so, but they claimed that diesel was the preferred fuel source for your vehicle, even though it only had like a 3 gallon tank or a 2 gallon tank, and then yet your quote unquote reserve tank was 20 gallons of gasoline. Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm looking at the chart now. The total amount of carbohydrate in the body, it's about 800 or so
Okay.
calories worth, which
Yeah.
is really not that much.
Nope. Nope. And we also have calories we can get from protein, but even then it was only about 2,000 or 2,400 or something in that
Yeah,
range,
well,
wasn't
it's
it?
looking at this chart, it's 6,000 grams worth of protein stored in our muscle, which is 24,000 calories. There's four calories per gram
Okay,
for protein and
24,000.
carbohydrate.
Okay.
So 20, that sounds like a huge amount of stored energy, but that energy is in your biceps and in your glutes and in your triceps,
We
and
don't
you
want to
do
be
not,
using that.
yeah, you don't want to be breaking that down for fuel. Now, there is a process by which amino acids can be converted into glucose. That's a very useful, helpful process. But for the most part, you don't want to break down your healthy existing muscle mass to use for fuel. So what else can the human body run on besides glucose and protein and amino acids? We can run on fat. And
Mm-hmm.
again, like if you've done some people watching, sad to say, in this country, you know that we really can store an almost unlimited amount of fuel as fat on our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like this example of this 155-pound person, and they didn't give like a body fat percentage or anything, but just as sort of an average person, they have about 135,000 calories stored in their adipose, which is the technical word for your fat tissue. 135,000 calories of stored energy versus about 800
Right.
of stored glucose. I
Right.
mean, that right alone, we can speculate what that actually means, but it might mean that, look, the human body is capable, the largest gas tank we have holds fat. So why would we want to run on the fuel that we hold so little of, which is glucose?
Yes. Yes.
Now,
And
I mean, let me clarify real quick. The human body always needs some glucose. There is a reason your blood sugar never goes to zero. So when I
yes.
say run on fat versus run on glucose, it's not binary. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
The body will run on multiple different fuels all the time, but one predominates, is what we're saying.
Well, and that brings me to the next two questions. So the first question I'm going to ask is about the glucose, quote unquote, being the preferred fuel source, but it being more maybe that we just can't store it. Um, I can't remember if you mentioned this in your book or if I heard it maybe in an interview or something. And I've kind of talked about this myself, and we even hinted to it earlier when we have almost like a hierarchy of fuels that we use, if they're present. So like alcohol technically is a fuel source. We get calories from it, but we have no way of storing it, and so it's the first to be burned. So can we talk a little bit about that? That with glucose, maybe it's not necessarily it's preferred. It's just since we don't have a way of storing it, maybe that's why our bodies use it so quickly. Is just because we can't hold on to it.
I mean, that's what some people have speculated, that it's not necessarily the preferred fuel or that it's a better, more efficient fuel. It just, we have to use it because we can't store a whole lot of it. Once your liver glycogen is full, once your muscle glycogen is full, the only other pathways for this glucose to be used is to either be used for energy immediately or be stored as fat.
Yep. Yep.
Unless, I mean, your blood sugar, like in type 2 diabetics, your blood sugar could go to 300-400, but that's not safe.
Nope.
That's not a long-term solution to the problem. And so there is something called de novo lipogenesis, which means the making of new fat.
Yeah.
And we generally make new fat from excess carbohydrate. Once your glycogen stores are full, and if you're not really using it for energy, you will store it as fat.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because, well, getting into that, what are the implications or what are the damages that happen if our blood, for those folks who don't know, we always hear too high a blood sugar is a bad thing. But what does that mean? What happens exactly when our blood sugar is into that 300 range and we're not breaking it down, we're not using it, we're not storing it?
Well, this is not something that should happen, every now and then, once a month, once every 6 weeks. You like to go to your favorite restaurant and just go crazy. Like, we're talking about when this happens sort of all the time, all day long.
Yeah,
when people
every
don't process,
day. Yeah.
Yeah, when people don't process carbohydrate the right way. The fancy word for it is glycation. People have probably heard that word, glycation. And when you get your hemoglobin A1C tested, that is glycated hemoglobin.
Yeah.
And it's glycated means it's become sticky with sugar. And I compare it to, like, if you have a child who's ever left a lollipop or a sucking candy out on a hot day and it like melted and got sticky all over everything. Think of that happening inside your bloodstream. That sticky, gunked up sugar. So instead of your blood being watery and nice and fluid, it's thicker. It's more like molasses, you know, and it's harder for your heart to pump that through your veins. It's more damaging to the blood vessels as it passes through. But the real complications of this chronically high blood sugar are all of the long-term complications we see in poorly managed type 2 diabetes.
Right.
So it really destroys the teeny tiny blood vessels in the kidneys.
Yep.
That's why so many diabetics have what we call nephropathy, or they end up on dialysis because their kidneys are destroyed. Yeah, same thing with the eyes, the retinopathy, because anywhere there's tiny blood vessels, like the kidneys, the eyes, even in the extremities, because it's so damaging to the blood vessels. This is why diabetics have so many problems with their feet.
Yep.
It's just, and we talked about how cardiovascular disease is the main manifestation of type 2 diabetes, because it's so instead of your blood vessels being rubbery and pliant and accommodating like a garden hose or a rubber tube, think of them becoming more like glass. It becomes like a glass pipette, if you remember from like your high school chemistry days. So now, instead of having water passing through this nice, easy, fluid hose, we have something more like molasses passing through a glass tube.
Right.
And it's much more brittle, it's much more fragile, and these blood vessels break all the time.
Right. Now, I'm going to profess my ignorance in this topic. As far as glycation goes, how does that affect? We talked about the kidneys, the eyes, the extremities. What effects does that have with our brain?
With the brain, if these neurons become glycated, then they become dysfunctional. Like we talked before, form and function. Function follows structure. If something is not built correctly or the structure gets damaged in some way, it's not going to have the proper function. And that's what happens with these neurons when they become sticky with sugar and caked up and brittle. That's just another form of damage to them. And not only that, but these amyloid plaques and proteins themselves can become glycated. So it just becomes this huge, sticky, brittle mass in the brain.
Gotcha. And so with glycation and its ugly stepsister, oxidation, let's kind of talk about that a little bit, because with oxidation, that's another research. Everybody talks about the big buzzword being antioxidants, but really we're talking about the damage of oxidation. Now, just like anything else, some levels, just like your beta amyloid plaques, some levels are perfectly natural. Oxidation is a part of regular, normal, healthy cellular function. But explain to my listeners a little bit more about what oxidation is, and then what happens when it becomes uncontrolled.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that it is a normal process, because people get really scared, like, oxidative stress, and I should load up on antioxidants.
Right.
But oxidation is also a signaling pathway. I mean, it sort of signals the immune system to do certain things. And so it's not all bad. But like you said, when it's uncontrolled and just rampant and it overwhelms the body's capacity to deal with it, then it's a problem.
Right.
So for people who don't know, the brain is largely built out of fat and cholesterol. The brain is just this big sack of fat and cholesterol sitting in your skull.
Right.
And a lot of the fatty acids in the brain are very susceptible to damage by oxidation. And if you've ever had a container of nuts sit around for too long and it becomes rancid and
Mm-hmm.
it takes on this really terrible odor and flavor and you can't eat it because it's rancid, that is oxidation. And it just basically damages the fats. And the same thing happens to the fats that are part of the physical structure of the brain, of these neurons.
Mm-hmm.
And it can happen elsewhere in the body too, but we're talking specifically about the brain.
Right.
And again, just anytime these cells are made out of these fatty acids, and if these fatty acids are damaged, then the cells don't work right. And if a cell membrane in a cell doesn't work right, well, good things can't get into these cells and bad things can't get out.
I see.
It's just... And a lot of this is caused by, in my opinion, our current diet.
Mm-hmm.
We consume a lot of damaged fats. All these liquid vegetable oils like corn oil and soybean oil and cottonseed oil. These oils are very susceptible to rancidity. And in fact, most of them are rancid before you even bring them home in the bottle.
They've been treated and colored and deodorized
Exactly.
to hide
Exactly.
that rancidness. Yeah.
Exactly. You don't know they're rancid, but they are, and then you eat them. And so not only are we actually consuming these, but it happens in our bodies to our cells through, various processes. But it's just, there's so many insults to our cells from the modern diet that it's hard to deny the link between this and dementia, but
Right.
people will try.
Yeah. So, we talked about glucose and how high glucose leads to glycation and all that stuff. Going back to what we were talking about before as far as storage, and the body does need some level of glucose. That's why, like you said, your blood glucose is never going to reach zero. Even if you eat, even if you're a carnivore, zero carb, person, your blood glucose is never going to reach zero. And that is due to a process of gluconeogenesis. Now, for the listeners who aren't very well versed in the science, it's not a big scary thing. Gluco is sugar, neo means new, genesis means create. So it's literally just saying creating new glucose, creating new sugar. Now, most of what you hear about gluconeogenesis, most that I heard about gluconeogenesis was in kind of the fitness keto camps about protein. Should we be high protein, low protein, etc.? And we do get gluconeogenesis from diets, because as a tangent, me being a keto freak, I'm really nerd out about ketosis, and some people are afraid of protein because of its effects on gluconeogenesis, and we can talk about that. But also, what really slapped me upside the head, and I think I learned this back when, but I really relearned it in your book, because you talked a bit about how even though our body doesn't need our body needs some level of sugar for operation, that does not mean that we need it from our diet. We can make glucose through endogenously, and we can do that derived from triglycerides, from fat. So can we talk a little bit about gluconeogenesis, why the body does need sugar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to consume sugar?
Yeah, this is such a huge topic, and gluconeogenesis is unfortunately very misunderstood in the low carb and ketogenic communities. Gluconeogenesis keeps us alive, frankly,
Right.
because if, like you said, the body does need some glucose, and that doesn't mean we have to get it from dietary carbohydrate. The
Right.
human body, I call it the ultimate reuse and recycle machine. We're constantly making things out of other things.
Yeah.
And if we didn't make glucose from anything, you would pretty much die on a ketogenic diet, or maybe not a ketogenic diet, because you could still be eating a little bit of glucose. But there are many, many people eating what we call a zero carb diet now, which is they're eating only animal flesh, only animal protein, only eggs. Some people do dairy, but only from the animal kingdom, with negligible amounts of carbohydrate, like little to none. but yet their bodies need glucose. Well, we
Right.
better have a way to make it.
Uh-huh.
So thank goodness we have gluconeogenesis. The big concern in the low carb and ketogenic communities with gluconeogenesis is that because amino acids from protein can be converted into glucose,
Mm-hmm.
they have the misunderstanding that if they eat a big steak or a big pork chop, all that protein is going to be made into glucose automatically,
Right.
immediately, regardless.
Right.
That is just not the case. I have a huge, enormous blog post coming soon on this. It's probably one of my longest posts ever, but it really needs
Awesome.
to be covered in detail, because gluconeogenesis, for the most part, is a demand-driven process, not a supply-driven process. Meaning, just because you have eaten something that can be converted into glucose doesn't mean it automatically will. That will
Awesome.
only happen when the body needs glucose.
Yeah.
And yeah, you mentioned that I wrote in my book that not only can amino acids be converted into glucose, but so can fats. But yet you never hear anybody worried about this when they're asking for a side of butter on top of their bacon with an extra side of
Right.
bacon. The triglyceride molecule that fats are made of consists of 3 fats joined to something called glycerol. Well, when you break down fats, 2 of these glycerols can be combined to make glucose. But nobody seems to be worried about this when they're drinking coffee loaded with butter and coconut oil.
Right.
So if they're not worried about gluconeogenesis from a lot of fat, then they shouldn't be worried about it from a lot of protein either. And in fact, I find with my clients, far too many people on ketogenic diets are under consuming protein dramatically.
Right.
They should not be concerned about a blood glucose or an insulin quote unquote spike from protein. It's really a misunderstanding of how it works.
So let me know. Let me know if I'm getting this right or not. So, with triglycerides, and getting into the science here, guys. With triglycerides, the backbone of that molecule is a glycerol molecule. So, did I understand that for you take 2 of those backbones? So, from the backbones of 2 triglycerides, you can derive a molecule of glucose. Did I understand that right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, what is and I'm thinking of this from a metabolism standpoint. And it takes calories, it takes ATPs to run all of these processes. What is because I've studied a little bit about gluconeogenesis and that happening from protein. That doesn't seem it seems to be kind of not the most efficient process, though, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but it doesn't seem like to be. It seems to your yield of energy from that doesn't seem all that great. Does fat have a is it easier to convert fat to glucose via gluconeogenesis, or are they about the same?
That's a good question, and if I understand the question correctly, I actually have no idea what the answer is. I don't know how metabolically costly it is to convert fat as opposed to amino acids. Yeah, I honestly don't know.
Yeah, it's just something that came to me, and I was like, I really don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. But anyways, that's going to be interesting to look into. That's going to be awesome. So
Yeah, it seems to be, though, I will say, I don't know the precise numbers in terms of the energy yield, but some people claim, and it's a controversial claim, we don't know if it's true or not, that a low carb or ketogenic diet has what we call a metabolic advantage, meaning even if you eat the same number of calories as somebody else on a higher carbohydrate diet, you could lose more weight, more body fat. And they speculate that the reason is partly due to that energetic cost. Like if you're consuming very, very little, perhaps no carbohydrate, your
right,
body has to make some of that glucose internally.
yeah,
And however much energy it costs to do that, to convert protein into glucose or to convert fat into glucose, is quote unquote calories that you're burning that somebody on a high carbohydrate diet of the same calorie content is not burning.
right,
And that might account for some of that advantage, but that's kind of speculation. We don't know for sure.
yeah, and. Oh man, we're going to go so into the weeds on this. I'm like a kid at Christmas here.
I love this stuff. Hopefully the listeners can follow. I try to not be too, or if we get scientific, that we can explain it in plain English too.
Exactly. Yeah, put it in layman's terms where you don't need a PhD to figure all this stuff out, because it sounds scary, but once you learn once you learn what this stuff really is, and it's not that technical. But anyways, so thinking about that, and like I said, this is going off my script here, so we're going to go into the weeds a bit. But with this whole thinking about this from an ancestral health hunter-gatherer type thing, you talked first about the possibility of the metabolic advantage. Now there's been some studies that show that even calorie for calorie, or people consuming the same amount of calories, people on low carb ended up burning an average of like 300 calories more a day, even though their intake was the same. But then there's been a recent study put out by Nusi, and it was was it who is that guy, Hall? Who am I?
Kevin Hall.
Kevin Hall was that they did a study, and I think it was a metabolic ward study, that they kind of maybe threw a monkey wrench in that hypothesis, and I actually haven't dived too deep into that study. So that may or may not be true, but I have some vegan friends. I'll admit that. No, I have some. I have some vegan friends that talk about
Wait. Are you, Matthew? Are you saying that you could actually be friends with and respect another human that doesn't eat the same way you do?
Correct. Yes.
Shocking.
I know. Shocking. It doesn't have to be a religion or dogma. It's incredible.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that was possible. I'm stunned.
But we were talking about it, and they're quoting back to me, the science about, of gluconeogenesis and it being kind of metabolic costly, and how does that, make sense from an evolutionary standpoint? If it's that inefficient, then should our bodies really be doing it? And then my rebuttal to that is kind of, for me to get 2,500 calories, thinking of ancestral health, hunter-gatherer type situations, me getting 2,500 calories from kale and eggplant versus nabbing a buffalo or a zebra or something and, feasting out, which one's going to be easier for me to, even if I consume excess calories, and some of those calories are going to be spent in the process of gluconeogenesis, which one makes more sense from an ancestral health evolution standpoint?
Say that again. I'm not sure I followed.
Well, I was just thinking from a standpoint of, hunter-gatherer type. Yes, we might be spending more calories on a low carbohydrate diet because of the inefficiencies of gluconeogenesis, but actually getting those calories into our systems is going to be easier protein, fat versus nothing but veggies. And
yeah, I think I don't know how energetically costly gluconeogenesis is, so I don't think I am totally speculating here. Let me emphasize that I don't know, but I can't imagine that like any hunter-gatherer risked starving to death because of gluconeogenesis.
Right. Exactly.
Like, oh my God, there's so much energy to convert my body fat into glucose, which is exactly what it's there for. Your body fat is there as a stored energy source. And even a lean person, even in 2017, someone who's very lean still has like a bodybuilder, a male bodybuilder could still have 8 or 10% body fat.
Yep.
Most women are running around 20 to 30% body fat. Yep. I just don't think there's that big a problem with it. And we never really run out of glycogen either, because if you deplete it, if it gets low, the body regenerates it even from protein. Like if you have gluconeogenesis from protein, guess what? A lot of that is going to go to refill the glycogen stores that you depleted in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's that big a problem.
Exactly. And that was just something that I got into recently with some friends because we were talking about that infamous What the Health movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't call it a documentary, but I call it a movie. But you know, their rebuttal to me was, because I talked about gluconeogenesis and being like, well, my body can make, even without me taking in a single gram of carbohydrate, my body can make all the glucose that it needs for function. And they were talking about their rebuttal to that was the metabolic inefficiency of it. And I was like, well, I don't truly know if it's that inefficient, but B, it just doesn't seem to be all that big of a concern. But anyway, so getting back onto topic a little bit about that, one thing I really found interesting in your book was the role of ketone bodies in brain health, and possible treatment or improvement with cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and all that stuff. And I hope my audience, being listening to the Ketodontist, hopefully my audience knows a little bit about ketones and ketosis. But can you tell my listeners a little bit about ketones and why they might be beneficial to brain health?
Yeah, this is kind of the real heart of my book. We had said that all of the drugs developed for Alzheimer's really do nothing to address the root cause. They're just sort of treating the symptoms. And we also said that the major problem in the Alzheimer's brain is that neurons in affected areas have lost the ability to get energy from glucose. So it's a big fuel crisis, it's an energy shortage, and these cells are essentially starving to death. The beauty of ketones is that even though these neurons have lost the ability to get energy from glucose, they can still get energy from ketones. Ketones are an alternative energy source. Think of the brain like a hybrid car.
Mm-hmm.
It can run on glucose or ketones or a couple of other things, but those are the two main ones. Now, ketones come from the breakdown of fat. Whether that's our own body fat or dietary fat, ketones are produced when we sort of break down fat at a higher rate than our bodies can use all of it, and it converts some of the excess into ketones. And for whatever reason, whatever is impairing these neurons' ability to use glucose, their ability to use ketones is not impaired. So this is not an overnight miracle cure for Alzheimer's disease, but at the very least, this is a huge inroad toward the fundamental problem, which is that these neurons are not getting any energy.
Right.
So we can at least give them some energy with ketones.
Right. And so, with that, a couple of things. Our brains still need some level of glucose, but we've already talked about that, about how our body can make it enough glucose endogenously that it doesn't need necessarily a glucose to come from diet. But also it seems, and maybe you can tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but when we are adopting a low carbohydrate diet or a strictly ketogenic diet, there's a time of adaptation. You have to have upregulation and the mitochondria and in the cells and its metabolic pathways to be able to use fat, to use ketones. But it seems like after a period of adaptation and your body's getting used to running on this fuel source, that the glucose demand goes down as it becomes more efficient at using ketones. Is that correct, or am I on par with that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. When you're on a ketogenic diet or you are getting ketones through some other way, because ketones can serve as this alternative fuel for the brain, it reduces the brain's need for glucose in the first place. Now, the brain will still need some, but the thing is, in Alzheimer's disease, it's not like the brain is using no glucose. It's just not getting enough.
Yeah.
So it could be that when you give, let's say, 40 to 60% of the brain's fuel from ketones, you only need then 40 to 60% from glucose instead of, 80%, 90%.
Right.
So you might sort of fill the gap that way. But with the ketones, there does seem to be some type of ramping up process, at least with the body. When people do it for athletic performance or for some other issue in the body, there does seem to be an adaptation phase where maybe you're not all that efficient at using ketones. But oddly enough, in Alzheimer's brains, they seem to respond pretty quickly. I mean, they've done randomized controlled trials where they will give people exogenous ketones, which is kind of like a ketone supplement. They drink these ketones, and within, I don't know if it's minutes, but within an hour or so, they measure these people's ketone levels. They are higher, and they have significantly improved cognitive function.
Wow.
So we know that at least when it comes to the brain, these ketones are very nourishing, very effective, and there doesn't seem to be the same kind of ramping up period that there is when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're maybe like doing a triathlon or something like that.
Gotcha.
It's almost like the brain seems really ready and wanting to use these as soon as they're available.
So it seems to have the metabolic flexibility to be able to uptake them right away versus muscle cells and stuff like that they seem to need a longer adaptation period.
That's what it seems like, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Well, so speaking of that, endogenous versus exogenous ketones. Endogenous, folks, means ketones bodies that our bodies make in the liver through our diet, and exogenous ketones meaning from outside sources like ketone supplements and stuff like that. Can we talk a little bit about that and its and their effects in Alzheimer's, and was one seem to be better than the other, or what's the role of both of those? Can we talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I usually actually discourage the use of the exogenous ketones with clients whose goal is fat loss or managing their type 2 diabetes, because the main benefits of a ketogenic diet, some of them come from the presence of the ketones themselves, but a lot of the benefits also come from the processes through which your body has to make the ketones, because your body's only going to make ketones itself when your blood glucose is lower, when your insulin is low. A ketogenic diet is anti-inflammatory. It does a whole lot of other things besides just give you ketones. Now, that being said, for people with Alzheimer's, especially people who are very severely advanced in the disease or are very elderly, you are just not going to get those people to change their diet. You're not going to get them to give up their orange juice and French toast all of a sudden for eggs cooked in coconut oil. So for people that are unable or unwilling to adopt a ketogenic diet, then I absolutely think these exogenous ketones can be really helpful, because they will, or in theory they should, improve cognitive function in the short term. You will have a noticeably improved, memory and behavior. But the exogenous ketones, unlike the ketogenic diet, the exogenous ketones are not going to do anything to correct the fundamental underlying problem. So I think they have a place, but they're not the best way to go. If somebody's younger and is willing and able to follow a different diet and change their lifestyle a little bit, I think do the ketogenic diet. Maybe you do both. Maybe you do the diet and the exogenous ketones. But again, for people that are really severely demented or very elderly and they can't do a diet change, then absolutely give them these ketones.
Gotcha. Very cool. So moving on past ketones, because like you said earlier, exogenous ketones can be a tool, but if we're dealing with health on different levels, whether it be, type 2 diabetes, weight loss, inflammation, whatever, really endogenous ketones is where we need to be focusing on. That's kind of the bee's knees. So I totally agree with that, and Luis Villasenor and I actually talk about that in our interview as well. But moving on past ketones, you also talk about the crucial role of vitamin B12 with brain health, and especially with the myelination or myelin sheath of our neurons. First off, I gotta give you kudos, because she had an awesome dental example of why dental health is so important, with dealing with B12 because B12 is often found in foods that are a little bit harder to eat and a little chewier and stuff like that. And I'll have Amy kind of talk to us about the foods that are high in B12. But if we don't have healthy teeth or we have ill-fitting dentures or whatever, it's going to be harder to consume foods that are high in B12. So kudos for you for pointing that out. I had a big star on the page on that on my
thank you.
my book. I was like, oh, that's awesome. Circled it, starred it, yeah, all that good stuff.
Oh, I appreciate that. I think we do take it for granted, or we sort of ignore the fact, when we make certain dietary recommendations for people, that things change as you get older, whether you want them to or not. Your stomach acid is reduced, you don't have quite as much digestive fire. And yeah, a lot of people lose their teeth or their teeth get weak, they're on dentures. It's not easy for an 82-year-old person to chew a steak.
Right.
So B12 is crucial for cognitive function. First of all, anyone who has any signs of dementia or memory loss should get their B12 tested. Now, the thing is, the range of B12 that's considered normal is really, really large. So if you're at the low end of normal, you might still want to supplement with B12 because you might feel better, you might have better results if you were up at the high end of the normal range. B12 is crucial for the synthesis of something called myelin, which is a substance that surrounds and protects and insulates the neurons. If you don't have good myelin or properly synthesized myelin, you are not going to have healthy cognition. And actually, one of the long-term effects of a severe B12 deficiency is cognitive impairment and cognitive decline, and it's irreversible. Supposedly, anyway, they say it's irreversible. And B12 is... I think actually B12 deficiency is sometimes mistakenly diagnosed as dementia because maybe we just don't have the proper way to assess B12, or we just ignore it. Maybe some doctors do. But B12 is found primarily in animal foods. It's high in red meat. It's I think egg yolks have B12. Shellfish is loaded with B12. Liver is loaded with B12. And of course, these are a lot of the foods that we've been cautioned against, whether it's because they're high in fat or they're high in cholesterol. It's just a tragedy. And I think it's one of the easiest things to correct if you have a B12 insufficiency.
Right. So, with myelination, folks, and Amy can piggyback on this if she wants to. Think of myelination like kind of an insulator for a conductor of like if you have a wire that's shooting electricity and it's wrapped in an insulator to help facilitate the direction of that electricity. The myelin sheath of our neurons acts in a similar way. Is that correct?
Sorry, say that again?
Oh, so I was talking about the role in myelin and why it's so important, and it acting almost like a conductor, conductor for the firing of that neurons.
Yeah, it's definitely required for healthy nerve impulse transmission between these neurons. And we didn't really talk about this, but we mentioned earlier that the brain is largely built out of fat. Well, yes. The brain and this myelin is not only built out of fat, but cholesterol. Mm-hmm. The brain is, I think they say something like in an adult human, the brain is about 2% of your body weight, but it contains about 25% of all the cholesterol in your body.
Right.
A full fourth of all your body's cholesterol is in your brain, that tiny little brain you have.
Right.
And the myelin is made out of cholesterol. Now, how many millions upon millions of our elders and not so elders are on statin drugs?
Right.
That is intentionally impairing the body's ability to synthesize cholesterol. And frankly, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the incidence of Alzheimer's disease has, the explosion in incidence has paralleled the use and growth of these statin drugs.
Well, isn't, even on the label, isn't a significant quote unquote side effect of using statin drugs is memory loss?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me. You can actually go on the FDA's website or the Mayo Clinic's website, and they will say without equivocation that side effects of these drugs are memory loss, confusion, behavioral changes. And they even say well, they say that these side effects are considered not serious and they resolve when the statin is no longer being taken. Well, that's great, but Matthew, how many people's doctors tell them to stop taking the statin?
Exactly. I never heard of it. Even if, okay, so now that we know that, well, science is showing that cholesterol is not indicative of cardiovascular disease, of heart attack risk, all that stuff. Mainstream medicine isn't quite there yet, but even if you get somebody gets in quote unquote healthy range of cholesterol, I've never heard of anybody's doctor taking them off once they're in that quote unquote healthy range.
Yeah, and it's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy and a travesty because, what are you going to say? Like, you're okay, you're literally losing your mind, you're losing your memory, but your cholesterol's great. That's
Right.
great, Mrs. Johnson. That's great, Mr. Jones. And I tell people, I give a presentation where I show a slide with a direct quote from the FDA's website saying that these symptoms resolve, when the statin is no longer being taken. And I say, well, okay, that's great, but they know that these drugs cause memory loss and cognitive decline. And you know what that means? Congratulations, you'll have the lowest cholesterol in the dementia ward.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
that's
whoop-de-doo, like it is truly, truly one of the great medical tragedies of our time. I think that we have demonized cholesterol the way we have.
Yeah. Well, and when you definitely get to it, get to the science that shows that cholesterol is not a good indicator for risk of cardiovascular disease anyway in the first place.
Right,
like I said,
because
that study earlier that I had mentioned, that it was about half, or it might have been over half, I can't remember, of heart attacks admitted to the ER. About half those people had what's considered low cholesterol.
right. I mean, it's just so misguided. I don't know if you know the work of Dave Feldman, but if people want to look up cholesterolcode.com, my friend Dave Feldman is doing some really fascinating experiments looking at cholesterol, and he's literally rewriting textbook paradigms, rewriting the entire philosophy because cholesterol really isn't what we thought it was.
Yeah.
Even within the low carb and keto communities, he's coming up with some really mind-blowing stuff. And the bottom line, if you need the 2-second version of it, cholesterol doesn't cause heart attacks.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we look at it, the fear of fat, the fear of cholesterol, and cholesterol is a building block of almost every type of cell in the body. I don't know if it is in all cells, but so many of, our cell layers are made of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a building block for so many cells in our body. And like you said, part of the brain, it's a major structural part of the brain. It just doesn't seem to me, why would we want to limit that?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not saying there's never a problem if your cholesterol is 400, 500, maybe
Right.
that is an issue.
Yeah.
But, we cannot deny the role of sufficient cholesterol in neurological function,
Right.
period.
Right. Yep. So, all right. Well, we talked with why statins and the medical community kind of seems to biff that up, and hopefully that's on the downward trend. I really don't know, but one big and you have a whole chapter, I think, dedicated to this in your book. We talk about risk factors of family history, diabetes, metabolic syndromes, all that stuff. But, with the advancements in technology of genetics and genetic screenings, there seems to be a highly correlated risk with a gene called the ApoE4 gene. Can you explain to me and my listeners a little bit about the ApoE gene, especially the 4 genotype, and what this ApoE's gene's role is in the body, and what makes the 4 genotype seem to be a little higher risk compared to the 2s and 3s?
Yeah, so this ApoE4 gene is what they call it the Alzheimer's gene, but right off the bat, we should clarify that this gene doesn't cause Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
We get two copies of each gene, one from our mother, one from our father,
Right.
and people that have one copy of this gene are at increased risk for Alzheimer's, and people with two copies are at like significantly increased risk.
Right.
The thing is, though, not everybody with Alzheimer's has even one copy of this gene, and plenty of people who do have two copies of this gene don't develop Alzheimer's disease. So this gene it's definitely a risk factor. It does increase your susceptibility to this condition, but it doesn't cause it. Like if you have this genotype, it's not a death sentence. It's not a sure thing that you're going to get Alzheimer's. And if you don't have it, it's not a get out of jail free card. You're not in the free and clear no matter what else you do if you don't have this gene.
Right.
Now, what the ApoE gene encodes for is a particular type of protein on the particles that carry cholesterol and nutrients through the bloodstream. They're called lipoproteins. If you've heard of like HDL or LDL, that's high and low density lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are just transport vehicles. Like cholesterol and fat soluble nutrients and certain other things can't travel in the blood on their own. They have to be packaged inside these particles.
So
and
think of it like oil trying to mix with water. It doesn't quite work.
Yeah, you have to put it in something else. So the ApoE creates a type of protein on the outside of this particle that helps it attach to and dock to its target tissues. So the different forms of this ApoE gene, there's 2, 3, and 4. I don't know why there was no 1, but there's only 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And they have a very, very slightly different shape. And because these proteins have a very slightly different shape, it actually has a very big implication for how they bind to and dock to their target tissues. The ApoE4 gene seems to be the one that is the least suited to a high carbohydrate diet. This genotype was selected against in population groups historically that had a grain-based agriculture. It's much more prevalent in hunter-gatherer type societies, meaning that the people who have the ApoE4 gene are the least suited or would suffer the most from eating a diet that's mismatched to this genotype, which would be a high carbohydrate, high grain type diet, corn, rice, wheat, all that stuff. And so again, this gene is not problematic in and of itself. It's only problematic in that the way most of us typically eat and live today is so far removed from the environment in which this gene was forged.
Right. So getting back to that, it's all about individuals themselves. If you have two alleles of the ApoE4 gene, you're going to be at a higher risk. But as we said in part 1 of this interview, genetics loads the gun, but it's diet and lifestyle that pulls the trigger. So this ApoE gene doesn't cause Alzheimer's. It is associated as a risk factor, but with the correct diet changes, the correct lifestyle changes, you can mitigate some of that risk, correct?
That's what we believe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't have written the book.
Right. So, well, let's talk about that then. With steps that people can take for reducing risk or getting improvement if they already have inflammation, if they already if they're, people are going to be on a spectrum from, very healthy to whether they're starting to get cognitive decline, to if they're in dementia, if they're in mild, moderate, severe Alzheimer's. People are going to lay on somewhere on this spectrum. Steps to prevent or to help tip the scales in the right direction, we should probably focus on nutrition first. What would your recommendations be for if you have a client that you're trying to help work this out with? What's kind of your process of recommendations for this person?
If it's somebody that is already afflicted with Alzheimer's, I would definitely recommend a very low carb diet, potentially some targeted supplementation, whether that's B12 or omega-3s or choline or, certain supplements that can help. But
Right.
depending on the severity of the condition and the person's willingness and ability to change their diet and lifestyle, I would hit it all guns blazing. Very low carb diet, exercise, maybe a little bit of fasting, make sure they get sleep. All of these things improve insulin sensitivity. That's not the only mechanism by which they work, but that is something that they all do. They all improve glucoregulation and insulin handling in the body.
Right.
For somebody that's looking to prevent this, or I should say potentially prevent, we don't know for 100% sure that we can prevent it with diet lifestyle, but assuming we can, I don't think a strict, super low carb ketogenic diet is required, right? I think the type of intervention that is required for somebody that's already very sick is different from the one that's required to prevent somebody from getting sick in the first place.
Correct.
What I do think is required is sort of glucose and insulin management. And some people will be able to do that eating, 150, maybe even 200 grams of carbs a day if they're very active. Many of us can't. Many of us have to stay at, 50 to 80 grams of carbs a day.
Right.
So I don't want to demonize carbohydrates across the board. Like I would never suggest that, cantaloupe or lentils are causing Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
But once
you can't eat those red bell peppers.
Exactly. Like, but once somebody's brain has already progressed to the point where it's not harnessing energy from glucose, what is the point in feeding them more and more glucose? What is the point in giving that person a potato or a slice of pineapple?
Right.
So yeah, for prevention, I just think a low insulin load diet, not just a low glycemic diet, but a low insulin load diet, exercise, maintain your insulin sensitivity as best you can and for as long as you can in your life.
So outside of a low carbohydrate diet, we talked about exercise being a crucial role. What is there in your research that you've done? Is there a specific type or types of exercise that seem to be the best on dealing with insulin sensitivity and mitigating some of that insulin issues?
Yeah, I think anything and everything is helpful, but specifically for insulin sensitivity, the high intensity stuff does seem to be best. And the more muscle mass you can build and retain, the better your insulin sensitivity will be as well. So don't just get out there and sprint, don't just run and jog, but if you really want to build some muscle mass, you want to do some resistance training. The intense stuff also helps, stimulate something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I always quote from this doctor that I spoke to a while back. He had the greatest line. He said, BDNF is like fertilizer for your neurons, or maybe he said Miracle-Gro. But
I see.
It's basically a compound that allows you to regrow or regenerate neurons. We used to think that the brain, you
had a finite amount
grow.
And it was done.
Yeah. Right. Like you can never grow new neurons. That is completely false. You can grow them. Now, that's something that declines with age. Like certainly a younger person has a much easier time doing that than an older person, but an older person can still do it given the right circumstances.
And I think, with the high intensity stuff, especially in my theory about it, strength training is so important because, when we look, I treat in my practice, I treat a lot of elderly folks, I treat a lot of nursing home folks, and the two biggest reasons that folks seem to be in a home when they're older is cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, dementia, all that stuff, or it's lack of muscle mass, a lack of strength, and they can't go unassisted. And so it seems like with me, the reason why with my exercise, the prime focus that I'm doing is on strength training because I have metabolic syndrome. I have 100 pounds to lose, and everybody would think that I should be out jogging, but I'm focusing mainly on strength training because I'm trying to help I'm trying to regain some insulin sensitivity, but also thinking of it from a longevity standpoint. we naturally are prone to decline in muscle mass, both men and women, as we age. And I want to be as strong as I possibly can into my 70s and 80s, to where I don't need help getting off the toilet. Does that make sense?
Oh my God, it makes perfect sense. And I myself have been thinking much more about healthy aging too. I'm 38, so I'm still relatively young, but
Yeah.
aging, as is everybody. And I couldn't agree more. So much of the debilitation and the decrepitude we see in older age is due to a loss of muscle mass,
Mm-hmm.
and muscle strength. And I think the longer you can remain strong, the more independent you'll be, the more mobile you'll be. Like if you get to the point where you can't get up out of a chair under your own power, you can't carry your own grocery bags, you
Yep.
lose the ability to live independently.
Yep. Yeah. Total loss of
So
freedom.
yeah, and to be honest, I actually don't enjoy weightlifting. I don't enjoy it, but the more, and if I think about it less from a body composition standpoint and even less from a weight loss standpoint, but more from a getting strong and
Right.
staying strong
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, that's actually better motivation for me to get to the gym and lift than thinking that I'm going to lose weight.
Right.
Because I think it's so much easier to build and maintain muscle mass when you're young and you start from the beginning than it is to start lifting when you're 70.
Well, and
Which is,
that,
you should still do that,
yeah,
do
it's
it,
never
but
too late, but do what you
exactly.
can do. But yeah, well, and
Right, but
it's just
easier
like
to
you
do
were
it
saying.
younger.
It's just like you were saying earlier with the with Alzheimer's and the pathways and the process and the damage. This happens in our 30s and 40s. It doesn't just happen one day. All this damage is done over decades.
Right, right. It doesn't happen out of nowhere. And so does the muscle building. You can't just, like we said, it's never too late, but it's much easier to prevent a a serious loss of muscle mass than it is to try to regain the muscle mass when you're already frail.
Right, right. So, outside of exercise and strength training, hit training, all that stuff, let's talk a little bit about other modalities. You talked about um, chronic stress and sleep. Let's dive into that just a little bit. I kind of want to hit on it, on the role of sleep and stress reduction and how that plays into everything here.
Sleep is huge, specifically for Alzheimer's disease, for a couple of reasons. One is it helps with insulin sensitivity. Again, just like all the other interventions I would recommend. The other thing is we've mentioned these amyloid proteins, and they are cleared away by that insulin degrading enzyme. And I think there's other methods by which they're cleared away. And some of these methods are more active when we sleep. I don't know why. I
I
can't
see.
explain why, but that's just the way it is. Some of these metabolic waste products and toxins are cleared more efficiently when we're asleep.
I see.
And scientists have actually speculated that that's why we need sleep. Every single animal organism that has been studied has some type of sleep-wake cycle. We have some type of circadian rhythm, and they speculate that it's because this is the time when all this stuff is sort of cleaned out of the brain. Um, so it's just so important. And I mean, what else can I say? That's
No, that
yeah, I mean, just it's good for insulin levels. It helps clear these toxins away. We know that short sleep and sleep apnea are big risk factors for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes.
yeah. Yeah, and I think everybody knows on an intuitive level, everybody knows good quality sleep and sufficient sleep is important. But I think sometimes knowing the reason why behind it, giving examples of, like you said, these metabolic systems being regulated in sleep, clearing out the clearing things out. The it's almost like you think at night in the big cities, the big street sweepers come in overnight and clear out the garbage from the streets and stuff and get it ready for the next day. I think by knowing some of those mechanisms, sometimes it can help it really sink in for folks. So.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, we are at our second hour of talking today. It's been awesome, Amy. Tell me a little bit more about your company, To It Nutrition. Tell me about what's going on with your blog. If you got any speaking engagements, and if folks want to contact you, what's kind of the best way for folks to get a hold of you?
My blog, my website is Tuit Nutrition, TUIT nutrition.com. They can email me through there or just at my email address, tuitnutrition@gmail.com. I am speaking at the Weston A. Price conference this year in November in Minneapolis.
Wonderful.
So yeah, I'll be speaking there about Alzheimer's disease. I am also speaking at a Keto Gains event in Florida in October, but we don't have a whole lot of the details on that yet. Other than that, I see clients in the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area if they're local, but I also help people via phone and Skype all over the country.
Awesome, guys. So, all my listeners, I really hope that you check Amy's book out. Take a look at her site. I'll have it linked up into the show notes. I'll also have links to places where you can buy her book. I think it's one of the most important books on science and nutrition that's come out in the last 5 years. It really, I mean, it is. I see it as a book that really is going to play a pivotal role in my understanding of science and metabolism, not just from an Alzheimer's standpoint and a healthy aging standpoint, but just overall metabolic processes. I cannot highly recommend this book enough. So everybody, I hope you check it out. If you know of anybody who could benefit from the book, give them a copy, and of course, really help spread the message. It's not. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, but it's not like you're getting the press that Dr. Davis or Dr. Perlmutter that you're on Dr. Oz and Oprah and all that stuff. This book seems to be a lot more organic driven and grassroots driven. Would that be correct?
For now, yeah. I mean, not to belittle myself, but I'm kind of a nobody. I'm not Dr. Perlmutter. I'm not. I think when Dr. Bredesen's book comes out in August, it might raise the visibility of mine if Amazon does that. Like, hey, people who bought this book also bought this one. But I hope that over time it builds, and that's being on podcasts like this is a way to start getting the word out, and hopefully it'll be the little book that could, and it'll spread over time. It just came out in the end of March, so it's only been a couple months.
Yeah, but that's really my goal, and why I really wanted you on here is because I think your message is very much worth spreading, and I wanted to help any way I could connect you with more people. And so they can pick up your book, they can learn, they can then go out in their lives and their friends and family and just keep, hopefully this takes a blaze and spreads like wildfire.
Well, I would say the same to you, and about your dental practice. We were talking, I think, before we started recording the first part. to tell your audience, like, I'm so thrilled that there's a dentist who's learning about this, because I don't think people have an appreciation for how telling your mouth is for the rest of the health of your body, the condition of your teeth. And if anyone's familiar with the work of Dr. Weston Price from back in the 30s, I mean, the teeth they say the eyes are the windows to the soul, but maybe the teeth are the windows to the body. I don't know.
Yeah, that's been my philosophy. I started down this kind of total health, complete health dentistry track about 3 years ago. And to mention Dr. Price, I just started his book up earlier this month, so been doing a deep dive on that, because honestly we didn't learn anything about his stuff in school, which is kind of surprising, considering that he was such a great researcher and a dentist that went out to all these places and did the in-depth research that he did for at that time was nothing short of amazing. But anyways, yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's in a hope that I have is not only getting people out there with this podcast, but also my patients, and getting this out there in the field of dentistry, because in dentistry we're primed in a way that's different than other medical professions, because the average person that goes to the dentist, they go twice a year, right? And with our the contact time that we have with either a hygienist and or the dentist is usually about 45 minutes to an hour twice a year. What other field of medicine do you have that sort of contact time with your medical professionals?
Right.
And so if we can broaden our scope, not necessarily treating or diagnosing, but screening for stuff. That's why screening for sleep apnea is a big boom in dentistry right now, because we're looking in the mouth, and we can help. We have ways to non-invasively do a screening of the tongue size and the airway and all that stuff, and we can be taking blood pressure and all that stuff. And most people who go to the dentist see their dentist more times than their physician. So if we can get that out there to broaden our horizons and take a bigger view at the person in that quote unquote holistic manner, I think the better it is in general.
Yeah, I agree.
So, no, very cool. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me, Amy. You are awesome. Your book is awesome. I see great things for you in the future, and I hope that I get to go to Keto Gains as well, and we can meet each other in person down in Tampa.
Definitely sounds good to me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy. It was a pleasure talking with you today, and anything I can do to help you out, you just let me know, okay?
Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right. You have a great day.
All right. You too.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody. So that was part 2 of our interview with Amy Berger. Holy cats, that was awesome. 2-parter. This whole, I did this with Luis, and now I did it with her. 2 hours of straight recording. This gives me a new respect for folks like Howard Stern and Joe Rogan and those folks that do this stuff day in and day out for hours at a time. Man, and it's just my brain is full. Holy cow. So anyways, thanks you so much for checking us out again on the Ketodontist Podcast. If you dig what we're doing, if you like what we're doing, help share the show. Subscribe to us, give us a review. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. We have a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is a little bit iffy because uploading hours of video, it takes a while. So the YouTube might not be up as quickly as the other audio only sites. But anyway, tons of ways to reach us. Like I said, if you like what we're doing, please give us a written review. That really helps boost our rankings so we're visible to more people. But I will let you go. If you guys want to get a hold of me, shoot me an email at ketodontist@gmail.com. Until I see you again, take care.